The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey there, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today titled Improving ORAT Outcomes with a Lifecycle Approach. I'm Nick Frank, producer at Trimble, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. But before I hand it off to our speakers, I do have a few housekeeping items that we do need to get to. Our webinar today should take about an hour. That includes the Q&A portion at the end. To make sure we keep the flow of the webinar going, all attendees are going to be on mute for the duration of the presentation. Now, you can submit questions at any time in the Q&A panel. Our presenters are going to get to as many as possible at the end and might be able to get to a few during the presentation. Don't worry, if you miss some things, this webinar is being recorded. The video and the slides will be sent out automatically over the next 3 to 5 days. And we do have some poll questions during the presentation, so please partake when they come up. We've got one coming around the corner here. And please stick around after the conclusion of the presentation for a post-webinar survey. We're always looking to look for your feedback for ways to improve our presentations. So our first poll of the day we will launch before we get to our speaker presentations. Just curious, when do you typically get access to your product data? We're talking things like asset lists and O&M manuals from your projects. Are you getting that early in the project and throughout the project phases? Is it right before or at the system facility opening? Is it shortly after the system facility opening, or never? You just collect the data yourselves. Feel free to throw your answer into the poll. We'll give you all another 10-15 seconds or so here to answer the poll question, and then we will move on to our presenters. I've seen a few more responses come in. Give another 5 seconds. All right, thanks everybody for participating in that poll. Now let's get to our speakers for the day. First on your left is Scott Yates. He is the Director of Digital Transformation in the Strategic Consulting Group at Woolpert, a leading architectural, engineering, and geospatial firm. His focus is on accelerating digital transformation and data interoperability in support of asset lifecycle management. He has provided expertise to more than 20 airports in North America, as well as additional organizations in the transportation, manufacturing, energy, and other industries. Eve McCall is the Director of Microsoft's Airport Industry Innovation for the US, aligned to the national, state, and local government practice. She is recently elected to the Airport Council International North American Business Information Technology Steering Group and has been an active participant of aviation conferences and the ACI World Airport IT Standing Committee over the past 4 years, presenting on topics such as sustainability, digital twins, cybersecurity, and hypercloud feasibility. She also is the World Business Partner co-lead of the ACI North American Data Analytics Working Group, supporting airports on various data AI objectives to improve operational efficiency, maximize revenue per passenger, and most importantly, enhance the traveler experience. And John Green is the Director of Airport Solutions for Trimble's owner and public sector. With more than 20 years of aviation industry experience, John has served in various roles, including Aviation Business Development Manager, Aviation Project Program Manager, and Military Airfield Manager at several locations in the US and internationally while on active duty in the United States Air Force. John is also a certified project management professional. And with that, John is the man to hand it over to kick off today's presentation.
Great, thank you, Nick, Scott, Eve. It's great to have you guys on this webinar with me today. There you go. So we're talking about ORAT, right? ORAT, Operational Readiness and Transition at an airport, and this, asset management during that process. It's a new concept to me. And I'm definitely glad to have Scott Yates on the call to talk about this because I'm not the expert at it. But I can tell you about Trimble's asset lifecycle management approach to the industry. What you see on the screen here is our secret sauce. Trimble can provide a technology solution for the entire entire lifecycle of an asset, from the design, build, operate, and maintain. And we do that through digital project delivery software, enterprise asset management software, in our connected data environment. Now, today's focus will be on the design build phase and then moving into operations and maintenance phase. Scott will get into that. But I just wanted to showcase this tech stack that we are providing to the industry. It's not just one solution, it's multiple solutions to help your organization manage your assets effectively. Next slide, please. Now, why should we digitize asset lifecycle management? Well, I'll tell you why. For many years, airport leaders and their business partners have made do with legacy, paper-based processes and antiquated systems pieced together through disjointed workflows using multiple sources of often unreliable data. It's no wonder that these outdated methods and technologies have dampened productivity and driven up cost. Airport asset lifecycle management is a process of connecting all phases of the asset lifecycle, as I stated earlier, plan and design, build, operate, and maintain, using a single source of accurate data across integrated workflows that streamline the handoffs from one team to another. This unified process improves efficiency and productivity while reducing waste and rework at every phase, so that projects can finish on time and on budget. In addition, this full lifecycle perspective enables a proactive and coordinated approach to asset maintenance with well-timed cost savings, preventative actions that reduce the need for expensive, disruptive major repairs. Now, digitizing asset lifecycle management is key. Obviously, for airport, safety is our #1 priority. If you're on the call and you work at an airport or connected in the airport in some way, we know that safety is a priority. We have the flying public going through our facility, through your facility, and we have to make sure that it's maintained to the standards. Another reason to digitize asset lifecycle management is compliance. I spoke about safety, but compliance is another requirement that the FAA drives us to run our airports in a certain manner. And why not move from that paper-based processes and get into a digitized world? Also, with our aging infrastructure, it's key to maintain our assets. Right now, not any airport out there has a brand new runway and taxiway system. So we know that most taxiways and runways have been built, 20, 40 years ago, and there's patchwork to get those things repaired. Now, if you digitize the management of that asset, you can be more efficient in how you manage your budget. And speaking of budget, the bipartisan infrastructure laws is sending funding down to the aviation industry. Why not take an opportunity and get some of that money to manage your assets effectively? Next slide, please. Another reason is proactive versus reactive asset lifecycle management. On the left, you see a runway center line, looks nice and clean, no problems. In the middle is a spall or a pothole that is at one of the airfields that I managed during my time in the military. That pothole was on the edge of the runway, on our only open runway at the time. And I had our engineers take a deeper look into it, and they discovered a void under the runway due to a failed drainage pipe that was under the runway. And so we had about a 1 foot void under the runway. And I immediately had to shut the runway down, which meant we had no fixed wing operations available to the airfield, which is a big deal. And so we had to get it repaired as fast as possible. The other runway was closed. So it went through a couple weeks of headaches and a closed airport in a major military hub, which that's why I have no hair. And so, yeah, I like to tell that story because you don't know what's lurking under your runway. And if we had a effective digitized asset management system, similar to what Trimble provides, we would not have had this problem. And so with that note, I just want to make sure that, it's key to know what's under your runway and what's at your airport and maintain it effectively. Next slide, please. Next slide. And as like I said, we're going to talk about ORAT, operational readiness and transition at airports, during the design build phase of a project. In my experience, usually you think about asset management when a project is complete. Scott Yates is going to tell us about why you should think about it during design build. It's a new concept to me, and I think you'll all enjoy this topic. Thank you. And Scott, over to you.
All right, thanks, John. Appreciate the introduction. I want to thank Microsoft and Trimble for inviting me here to speak on this topic, something that is near and dear to my heart and pretty passionate about. I have a tremendous amount of respect for both John and Eve, so this is fantastic to be on a panel with them presenting this subject. Why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide? So just a quick introduction of myself. So my name's Scott Yates. I'm the Director of Digital Transformation in the Strategic Consulting Group for Woolpert. Basically, in my role, I work with owner organizations to help digital transformation efforts across the entire asset lifecycle. And in particular, recently, my focus has been on this gap in between the design and build phases of the asset lifecycle and the operate and maintain phases of the asset lifecycle. And I think my history provides an interesting perspective on why I'm so passionate about this. I've spent over 20 years doing enterprise asset management implementations and consulting engagements in multiple industries, but a lot of that was in the aviation industry. And the biggest challenge we always had on our projects, the critical path on the project, the long pole in the tent, the highest cost, was always in data acquisition, data cleaning, and data loading into the enterprise asset management system. And to be honest, I can't think of a single project where we ever felt just really good about the data that we had in the EAM system. It was the bane of our existence. And so in recent years, I've been able to get more involved in capital and construction projects earlier in the life cycle and planning, design, and construction. And it was like someone pulled the curtain back and showed me all the data I've been looking for 2 decades. And so, I've become very passionate about how do we connect the dots between planning, design, and construction and operations and maintenance, as far as allowing that data to flow through from the designers and builders ultimately to the owners who are going to have to operate this system asset facility for, potentially 40, 50, 60 years. So I'm also the data chair of Building Smart USA's airport working group. So focused on, data standards and open BIM standards and how we can bring those to the aviation industry to improve the data acquisition from capital projects into an airport's other enterprise applications. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So today, I'm going to chat briefly about what ORAT is. So you've heard that term a couple times now. I know many of you are probably familiar with it, but I imagine some of you aren't. If there's anybody joining us from outside the aviation industry, you may not be as well. It stands for Operational Readiness and Airport Transfer. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that is. I'm also going to talk a little bit about digital asset data delivery and common data environments and this concept of getting asset data earlier in the project and what that means. And then I'm going to try and tie the two together. I'm going to tell you how getting that asset data, hands on it, visualization of it earlier in the process can benefit the ORAT process and ultimately the outcomes that we get from ORAT. So that's the message here today that I'm going to step through. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So ORAT, what is it? Why do we do it? Next slide. All right, so I love showing this graphic anytime I'm talking about asset lifecycle management. If you've heard me speak before, if you've been on my LinkedIn or looked at any of my articles, I repeat the phrase asset management starts in planning and design over and over and over again. And I'm a firm believer of that. When you look at the entire asset lifecycle, what this graphic is showing you, focus on first on the gray dotted line. And basically that's telling you that even though 75% of an asset's total cost of ownership is going to be accrued in the operations and maintenance stage, the opportunities in order to reduce TCO decrease drastically as you proceed through planning, design, construction. It's basically saying the majority of the variables that are ultimately going to drive total cost of ownership of a system, facility, or asset are baked in as you plan that facility or system, as you design it, and then ultimately as you build it. Once it's handed over to the owner, yes, they have the ability to affect TCO through, efficient maintenance and proactive reliability practices, but their ability to influence that asset, how it's been designed, how it's been installed, and its intended use is quite minimal, right? So, they can optimize the efficiency of how they're going to maintain it, but many of the factors that ultimately drive its sustainability, its maintainability, its resiliency have all been baked in through the planning, design, and construction phase. And really, ORAT is a recognition of this. ORAT is really asset management principles brought to bear earlier in a capital project. So, we are considering how the facility is going to be utilized, providing input ultimately to its design and construction, and then ultimately transitioning the best practices on how to operate that facility as we move into operations and maintenance. So, what I like to say is ORAT really is just good asset management. It is a recognition that beginning asset management earlier in the life cycle can produce some significant benefits. Let's check out the next slide. So just a definition, you're going to hear several different interpretations of the acronym ORAT. Today, I'm using Operational Readiness and Airport Transfer. I've heard it called Operational Readiness and Asset Transfer. I've heard it called Operational Readiness and Transition. But regardless of what specific terms you use to the acronym, the process is essentially the same. The definition of this is that it's a systematic and structured approach that's used in the aviation industry to prepare for the opening or expansion of an airport facility. So when we have a large capital project, a renovation, a new system being implemented, all the way up to a brand new terminal, it's the idea that we want to, in parallel with the design and build of that facility, start looking at how that facility is going to be operated, so we can put ourselves in the best position to do so once it's handed over. And ultimately, we're trying to achieve a smooth and efficient transition from basically static operations of the facility to dynamic operations without any disruptions in that process. And one of the things I like to say is, the go live or the grand opening of a new facility should be a celebration, yet, all too often it's a crisis. It's an exercise in firefighting. So ORAT's about putting yourself in a position to be able to celebrate the opening of a facility or the implementation of a new system versus running around and firefighting on day one. Let's jump to the next slide. So taking a look at the complete process for the people who aren't particularly familiar with ORAT, this is kind of a good refresher. Different organizations may have slightly different terminology or layout of these activities, but I think this matches a pretty common accepted framework that's out there in the industry. We have some airports that have dedicated teams, some contract out this capability on a project-by-project basis, and then other airports may not have a formal program or team, responsible for this, but no doubt they're doing the activities that make up ORAT, as they're taking on large projects. But the way this is laid out is it starts with planning, and this typically aligns and starts in the planning phase of a capital project and can carry all the way through design and even into the early stages of construction. But what we're doing during this phase is we're engaging stakeholders that are going to leverage the asset, system, or facility, that are going to use it, they're going to operate it, they're going to maintain it. And we're kind of doing a two-way data exchange. We're trying to help them understand what's coming down the road to best position them to be able to take on what their role or responsibility will be when the facility opens. But we're also looking for feedback to ultimately drive things that need to be considered as we plan, design, build, and then ultimately operate the facility. And really, we're starting to build the operational concepts of what is the facility going to be used to do, and therefore, what types of policies, procedures, resources do we need to have in place, particularly as technology modernizes. Oftentimes, moving from one facility to a new facility involves entirely new skill sets, entirely new disciplines, potentially even organizational changes associated with the change in the physical built environment. So during this phase, we're identifying the standard and contingency operating procedures that are ultimately going to be needed to smoothly run the facility once it's been built. As we look at the training phase, so typically this is going to begin maybe late design into when you're actually doing construction of the facility. And what we're doing here is we're familiarizing those stakeholders that we were engaging earlier. Now we're giving them familiarization as the design takes shape, as the facility takes shape. We're making them aware of the progress of that, and we're allowing them to become familiar with what the new system, new facility, new asset is going to be like. And this is where we're starting to define what type of training is going to be required and build out the training both for operations as well as individual equipment training for the operators of that equipment and the people that are going to maintain that equipment. So we're starting to develop what that training plan is and starting to do training type activities based on what we know about the facility. The next major phase of ORAT is testing, and this kind of aligns with the latter stages of construction and the commissioning phase of a large capital project. And so the ORAT team is supporting testing and commissioning. One of the best ways to learn about a system and facilities to actually participate in the testing and commissioning activities. that are taking place as part of the install. With new terminals, with large projects, you're likely doing what we call trials or dry runs, where we're actually simulating scenarios that are going to happen within the facility and making sure that the operations teams and the maintenance teams and everyone that's and third party service providers and tenants, everyone's aware of how things are going to happen once you're moved into that new facility or operating that new asset. And so this also includes advanced and integrated trials, and a little bit later I'll give some examples of where that can be particularly beneficial. This leads us up into go live day or grand opening, where we're ultimately executing the changeover. And so that phase involves mobilization. How are we going to get people into the right place? This may involve actually physically moving, in many cases, from one building to another. So it's mobilizing people and other resources to get them in the right place to support the opening of the new facility, and then the actual activity of opening it. And then, of course, there are still activities that are considered part of ORAT post-opening, where we're supporting the ongoing operation of the airport, doing things like debriefs and audits of how the project went, what can be improved in the future, what type of refresher training might be required, what operating procedures may have been missed that need to be caught up on. So that's a basic overview of the process. Let's go ahead and hit the next slide. So that's ORAT. So that was the first concept I want to get across. The second concept is digital asset data delivery, right? So when should we be getting data and how should we be getting data? So I want to talk a little bit about the basics of this, and then again, I'm going to tie it back into the ORAT process. Let's do the next slide. The term I've loved that I've been using all over the place is the golden thread of data. Now this is a term that was coined out of a position paper from the UK government after the Grenfell Tower disaster over there. And basically the idea here is that there is data that is being created and generated from the very conception of the idea of building a building or a facility. And as you plan it, more data is generated. As you design it, more data is generated as decisions are made and things change. As you construct it, more data is generated. And then ultimately, this is handed over for operations and maintenance and for people to actually occupy the building and facility. And so the idea is that this data that's being generated throughout that process is critical to ultimately maintaining the reliability and safety of that facility throughout its entire life cycle. So the specific definition of the term here is it's the information that allows you to understand a building and the steps needed to keep both the building and people safe now and in the future. So it was safety that was driving this original study and this original idea of needing to preserve the data across the asset lifecycle phases. But you can take the exact same concept and apply it to sustainability, to maintainability, to total cost of ownership. The idea is that there's critical data that's being created at the same time that the physical facility and asset is being created, and it's imperative that we make that data easily accessible to downstream phases and downstream activities, because it can have a very profound effect on the decisions that we make and the speed of the decisions that we can make for whatever our role or responsibility is later on in the asset lifecycle. So I love this idea of looking at digital transformation in the asset lifecycle as constructing a golden thread through all of these phases that involve very different stakeholders, different procurement vehicles and contracts, different objectives and goals. Each one of those phases has their own drivers, but connecting the data through those phases so that, if you're an owner on the back end that's got to maintain this thing for the next 30, 50, 60 years, you have that entire story and that entire history to work from to be able to make all the decisions you need to make to keep that thing operating as efficiently as possible. Let's move to the next slide. So traditionally, the way this has looked, and probably the way it looks, I would imagine, at many of your organizations, this is how it looks at almost every organization I've worked with over the last 25 years, is that what you have is this data being created, and the contract defines what those specific project deliverables are in the form of, asset lists, product data submittals, O&M manuals, and typically the contract is going to define that these need to be provided, in paper format, essentially in PDF format. It may come to you electronically on a disk, but at the end of the day, these are just files that are on a disk or stored on a network share somewhere, and they're provided to you. And this is all the information that we were obligated via contract to give to you for you to be able to do what you need to do at this facility. And then what we see at most organizations is, maybe there are some groups within the airport or whatever type of organization we're talking about that are proactive about wanting to get their hands on that data and get it into their departmental systems. So they go and get that data. They may have, migration processes defined to pull that data out, clean it up, load it into their systems. But typically it's being done in a very kind of siloed and piecemeal fashion. The people that leverage the GIS system are pulling out what they need, and then they run with it in their system. The people that are using the enterprise asset management system pull out what they need, and then they're running with it. And what happens is, not only is that inefficient as far as getting the data into those systems, if the right data was even there in the first place, but it also kind of proliferates these individual departments and systems drifting away from each other, because they all took the data independently. They're all managing the data independently. And so, tying back to this golden thread analogy, what you're actually seeing is, the thread was kind of handed to you in whatever condition it was handed to you, but immediately it begins to fray as we disperse it into, these unconnected systems that we're using to run our operations throughout our enterprise. Let's go ahead and hit the next slide. So now if we introduce the concept of digital asset data delivery, so we're attaching standards to our procurement contracts which define the data we want to receive, when we want to receive it, and the manner in which we want to receive it. And really it's capitalizing on what is now possible from a technology standpoint in relation to BIM and virtual design and construction. But putting our owner hats on, if we as an owner start to think about the concept of having a common data environment for all this information that's being generated on our projects, and engaging that environment early and getting this data as soon as we know it. As soon as we have a design architecture model, there's information that's important to us that we can glean out of that, pull into a system to make it accessible to our own people and stakeholders, and begin planning from. And what happens then is this CDE becomes, this common data environment becomes an asset registry. And we can use it as a staging place or a clearinghouse for data that as soon as it's ready, we can start integrating it from the registry into our GIS system. So, as soon as we have the site plan laid out for where the facility is going to be built, that's something that we can represent in our GIS system. And then as construction progresses, we can enhance what's represented in our GIS system. As we get our hands on the actual types of assets to be installed, we already have some understanding likely of the type of preventive maintenance plans we want to put in place for those. We can start marrying that data up, the product data submittals, the O&M manuals, PM programs we may already have in place for our other facilities, and we can start bringing that data and staging it in the EAM so it's not a scramble to do so after project handover. And on and on and on. You can see that if we have access to this data earlier in the process, and we have a place where we can continue to update it, work with it, visualize it, integrate it, we're binding that golden thread now. We are maintaining that golden thread across these systems, and we're doing it early so that when you get to project handover, from a data and an IT perspective, it's really a non-event. You already have it integrated in a lot of the most critical places. And I'm going to talk certainly about how that helps ORAT processes as well. Let's move to the next slide. So that's my segue into, okay, so we've talked about ORAT and generally what it is, and we've talked about digital asset data delivery and generally what that is. And so now I want to tie those two together and talk about how having better asset data earlier in the process enables ORAT and improves ORAT outcomes. And one of the terms I like to use here is what I call the 4 A's of data interoperability. And so this is, when I say better asset data, this is what I mean. It is abundant, so we have all the data that we need. It is accurate, so it represents the as-built conditions. It is accessible. This is critical and a big theme of what I'm talking about here today. It's got to be available to me in a way that I can visualize it, understand it, interact with it, and connect it to other systems. And it's got to be as soon as possible. We want it as early as it's available to work with. As early as it's accurate enough to be useful to us, we want to have access to it, because the earlier we have the data, the more preparatory decisions can be influenced by that data that we have. It makes the process more efficient, it makes it quicker, and that's what I'm going to try and show here today. Let's move to the next slide. So specifically, some of those benefits of having a common data environment, having access to this asset data early, is it enables strategic planning. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those activities that we do in that early planning phase of ORAT, and how having access to current data from the project can greatly improve that process. It improves the training and testing phases as well. So I'm going to show how, having that asset data gives us the ability to better identify what training we need to do and build those programs, as well as ensure that we're doing all the appropriate tests and trials and using the information in our tests and trials, and how that improves that process. And then also about how critical it is to have complete and accurate histories. And when I'm talking histories, I'm talking about the history of the asset, which certainly started before the facility opened. It started as soon as it was built and sent to the job site. So these are the kind of the main benefits that I'm going to hit on over the next few slides. Let's move to the next slide. All right, so early data enables strategic planning. So what having early access to this asset data, does for us, whether it's in the form of BIM models, drawings, O&M manuals, product data submittals, but having our hands on this data as early as possible in the process gives us the ability to visualize and validate operational concepts. So I talked about before, one of the key activities happening here is we're defining the operational concept of how the facility is going to be used. Well, I can do that in a conference room with a whiteboard in kind of an imagination setting, using people who have tribal knowledge to try and figure that out. And if I got the right people in the room, it's going to work. We're going to get to where we need to get to. But if I have the ability to actually immerse myself in that model, in that facility, in that data, we have a much better chance that we're not going to miss something. We have a much better chance to make connections against things that may appear disconnected on 2D paper. And so it really puts us in a position to be far more confident, far more quickly about the operational concept of the facility. It also puts us in a position to do strategic asset management planning. If I have an idea of the type of systems that are going to be going into this facility, as soon as I have that idea, I can start looking at a lot of industry data stores and even my own databases to start understanding what type of support those assets are going to require, how critical they are to me, what level of service they're going to require, and therefore what level of investment. I should be able to predict at some level total cost of ownership in the design phase of a project. There's no reason why I shouldn't be able to do that if I have the right data at my fingertips. And then of course, identification of required SOPs and COPs, as well as required training. If I have a clear list of what systems are going in, what assets are going in, I have a much clearer checklist of what type of operational procedures and required training I'm going to need. The validation, again, is a lot more clear and it's a lot quicker. Let's move to the next slide. It also helps by integrating the data that we're getting earlier into our enterprise systems, our various enterprise systems. It improves testing and training as well. One thing that this can do is we have the ability to train with real data. Recently, I was involved in a project, which is a brand new terminal, and we were actually able to get the data from the project into the EAM in advance of the terminal trials. So as we were running through terminal trials, which is a key component of ORAT for airports, we were actually able to put the software in the hands of the technicians that were being trained and running through the trials. And so they were using the software that they were going to use on day one, and they were interacting with the actual asset data for that facility. So, they weren't having to just simulate, well, okay, this is where I would enter a work order in this point in the process. They were actually doing that in the EAM system that was going to be used with real data. So both the training and the trials can happen with real data. Something pretty cool along these lines. There's actually, for those of you, I know this is probably overshadowed by Apple Vision Pro release that just happened, but for those of you that have the old Oculus Quest or the Meta Quest, there's actually an application you can get right now. You can go do it right now, download it and play with it, that allows you to immerse yourself in a VR environment and perform the operations that you would perform in a gate turnaround at the apron. This is an application you can go get today and play with and simulate those activities. So just thinking about that use case and expanding it, the power that having this data early on in the process is going to add to your training programs and testing programs is really almost immeasurable. And it also gives you the ability to identify issues early and adjust. So, you know, if you're doing testing and training with the real systems, you can see where the gaps are, where the problems are, and you may have an opportunity to address that before the facility actually goes live. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. And then also early integration ensures complete histories. So the installation and commissioning activities that are being done, they're typically captured as a part of the project, and they may be provided again as a part of that file dump. But if you've already got your EAM system up and running, you actually have the ability to capture those activities directly in your EAM system, get more accurate installation dates, get configuration data as far as how that asset has been set up, you know, from the commissioning directly into your EAM systems. You can capture that at the source. You can also get any pre-handover maintenance. You know, some of this stuff gets installed a year, 18 months before the facility actually gets to full operation. And so maintenance activities are taking place on those assets during that time frame. If you have that asset data earlier, you can capture those activities. Certainly it puts you in a position to get day one issues captured. There's always issues on day one. And so being able to have your system already in place to capture service requests and maintenance history on day one is huge. And that puts you in a position also to leverage warranty coverages. I think this is an area that most organizations I work with are hugely missing the opportunity to leverage warranty coverages that might be in place simply because they don't have a system that's proactively keeping track of where that coverage may be and that they've just done an activity that might be covered under warranty. Let's jump to the next slide. And so the reason why having no history gap is so important for those of you out there that are, studiers of reliability, you've probably seen this graph before. It's the famous bathtub curve. But basically, this is looking at the typical failures that happen on assets, you know, after they've been installed. You typically have a higher incidence of failures we call infant mortality, either because it was poorly manufactured, it was installed incorrectly, the person who's operating it hasn't been trained appropriately, but typically you have a higher frequency of failures in that initial phase or life cycle of the asset. That tends to flatten out to where you get into random failures. Could be based on condition, context, random acts or improper use. And then as the asset ages, we see the failures increase again just through, you know, things like fatigue and other things that happen to assets with age. So the end result of the volume of these failures, the frequency of these failures, looks like a bathtub, higher in the beginning, higher in the end, lower in the middle. But this is critical because that higher in the beginning, often for a lot of organizations, is a time period where they have not gotten the data from their project yet. They do not have it in their enterprise asset management systems. And so they don't really have a good ability to capture the issues and events and failures and, like I said, service requests that are happening in this high volume period. And that puts them at a disadvantage to make, you know, both better decisions at that time that are going to improve the reliability and sustainability of the facility or system, but also later on when we're trying to figure out maybe years down the road what's happening with this asset. We've got this chunk of history at the very beginning for both that asset as well as all its brothers and cousins. It's data that we're missing and can't bring into the equation. So it's critical that, you know, we have the ability to capture this on day one. Next slide. So just to wrap up here, to make sure, I want to try and give Eve some time to talk as well. I can get long-winded. Some final thoughts to wrap up. ORAT, right? Operational Readiness and Transfer, or Operational Readiness and Airport Transfer. It's just good asset management. That's what it is. It's an understanding that managing a facility begins long before it's handed to us. It begins in planning and design. And so ORAT is a recognition of that, and it's dedicated principles and activities and phases and deliverables to ensure that you're doing those things long before project handover. Also, another final thought, early asset data visibility improves ORAT outcomes. You know, if we have the ability to touch and feel the system, the facility, the data that's coming our way, then all of these things that we're trying to do by using our tribal knowledge and think out to the future of how we might be impacted become a lot easier to get to, and we have more confidence that we're not missing anything because we're seeing it right in front of our face. And then the kind of last final thought here that I want to leave you with before I hand it over to Eve is, you know, common data environments, and this concept of an owner having a common data environment during their capital projects enables earlier asset data. That, along with things like open standards, puts us in a position to be able to receive and consume that data very early on in the process, so we can use it as a tool as we're doing these ORAT processes, but also so we can integrate it with our enterprise systems much earlier in the process than, you know, at some point, weeks, months, maybe even years after the facility has been built. So those are kind of the main points I wanted to leave you with, and I'm gonna hand it over at this point to Eve to talk a little bit about how infrastructure supports all this.
Thank you so much, Scott. Such an inspiring and fascinating conversation or a talk. You know, I took several notes on what you presented, because I think, you know, that golden thread philosophy is so critical. You know, so people might be wondering, why is Microsoft on a conversation about aviation or, you know, operational readiness and airport transfer? So I wanted to kind of underscore that, as Scott was talking about, and John before him, all of these outcomes are really fed through leveraging a common data environment and thinking about modern data. And as we're in the design and planning phase of building a new terminal or extending or modernizing any of our technology, you know, I think it's important to also consider all of the different ways that the data is going to be used. So I think of it really as not only a golden thread that's linear, but really more almost of a continuous feedback loop. So if you can go to the next slide, I could talk a little bit about this. So, you know, when we think about the data that's coming in around the assets that have been collected, and just looking at, again, that history, you know, that bathtub graphic that Scott was just showing, it's not only for readiness at the time of airport transfer, but then also how you're going to maintain those assets over the time, and ultimately have that data store to be able to apply models to get to truly predictive maintenance. So even in the scenario that Scott was describing around, you know, the different types of assets that might have had infant mortality or some other issue, how are you tracking similar assets or the contracting and the maintenance agreements that you have against those assets over time? And then how does that data come back and feed to other data sources or other use cases from stakeholders? So some of the scenarios that I think about are the integration with other systems. You know, we talked a lot about enterprise asset management, and in an earlier slide, Scott referenced ERP and IoT and some of those other kinds of data integrations. Ultimately, even digital twin, a favorite buzzword today in the airport space, which really, again, is how do you take all of this data and apply you know, the digital representation of the physical world to get greater insights on your asset performance, and also, again, how that impacts other stakeholders or other operations downstream. One example I can easily think of is around passenger flow, right? And as your assets are performing or failing, how do you manage the maintenance of those, or even communicating to other stakeholders if, for example, a conveyance is down? How do you optimize the traveler experience and airport operations accordingly? Another example is around sustainability reporting, right? So I know that's a mandate for airports today, you know, not only ultimately to just report on sustainability efforts, but ultimately to achieve those carbon neutral commitments that airports are making. How do we leverage that enterprise asset management data and its utilization, especially around things like energy utilization, to be able to better track on that data and report on it, and then again, feed it back to other use cases. So, within the context of Microsoft, we think about the digital feedback loop across different kinds of stakeholders, such as customers, employees, operations, and products. This is somewhat of a general slide, not specific to airports, but when you think about customer signals, that could be, again, how do we improve the traveler experience through better awareness of the assets that we have, not only at transfer, but hopefully we've been planning and designing for those experiences previously, and we're considering the data that needs to be acquired, loaded, and cleansed, so that way we can better create that impact. Employees are both, of course, internal airport employees, as well as the numerous contractors and partners, concessionaires, retailers, parking, baggage handlers that we have. And how do we, again, enable those people to be more effective with, for example, first-time repair rates when we think about maintenance. Having that information around the asset performance and reliability, as well as maybe some of the history of what's failed in the past. And then again, real-time awareness of how the system continues to perform, so we can be more responsive and improve that first-time repair rate. We think about operations, it's not only the operational efficiency that I just described about asset maintenance, but also how those systems interact, as I mentioned, around energy utilization, all up as an example, or how one system impacts another system upstream and downstream, and how we can be more efficient in that. And then from a products perspective, that's a generic commercial concept, but in the case of airports, we are in the business of monetizing some of our systems, or even just providing better products, meaning service products, such as ways of informing our travelers of the services available in our facility, and providing that kind of wayfinding guidance and provide that better traveler experience. So ultimately, also this data that's created through this common data exchange, the CDE model, can also inform, as I mentioned, digital twins in the future for all sorts of downstream use cases. So again, we want to be thinking in that design, planning, and build stage, the data that you do need to acquire, that is really frequently one of the most difficult pieces to tackle, how we help with that operational readiness and airport transfer across the different components that you're managing, but then also thinking proactively about how we might use that data for other purposes and start planning around that as well. So Trimble, Wilbert, and Microsoft are here to help you with any stage along this journey, and how we can help technology better enable the outcomes that you seek. So with that, I will hand the microphone back to Nick, our fearless leader for coordination, and we welcome your questions.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Great job. Scott and John and Eve, great presentation, a lot of great information. We do have a handful of minutes here for any questions that anyone has for any specific person. You can specify it for one individual or just a kind of open panel. One of the first ones, I think this one's probably gonna go for Scott, is, what were the challenges as maybe an organization that came from self-reporting to then transitioning to trying to have a more digitized system? Like, what are the challenges of transitioning?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge is just recognizing the importance and dedicating the resources. I mean, that, I think that it's the same challenge, we see across the board as far as trying to look at asset management earlier in the process. Is too often it ultimately boils down to a people and procurement problem, because too often people are, governed and driven by the contracts they're working with under. I have a responsibility to design this thing and stay under budget and stay on time. I have a responsibility to build this thing, stay under budget and stay on time. So everyone, really likes to, they're motivated and incentivized to stay in their swim lane. And ORAT is an understanding that the facility benefits and ultimately the organization benefits when we break out of those swim lanes and we start considering the downstream operation very early on in the process. So I think the biggest challenge is at the highest levels of the organization, making that paradigm shift, that thinking shift, and then dedicating the resources, understanding that putting time in up front is going to have a payoff down the road. Because too often, we're measured on very short time horizons and planning horizons, and ORAT is not a short planning horizon type of activity.
What does that time frame look like from, you get the buy-in from the top and you start implementing? Is this a 6-month, 2-year, 5-year? What does that kind of time frame look like?
It's a forever thing. I mean, so again, it's, I look at it as a program, not a project. And asset management in general is a program, not a project. It is a discipline that your organization is gonna exercise ad infinitum for the rest of its existence. And so, you can get quick wins. Every little thing you do on a project, improving the specifications for the data that you're requiring from your contractors, so it comes in consistently. That's a small step that you can make on your very next project that's going to vastly improve the effort it takes to move your asset data into your EAM system. So that can happen very quickly. That can happen almost overnight as an attachment to your next contract. But building a program like the one I laid out, which some airports have very formal programs, it takes time to do that, over time. You dedicate more and more investment and resources as you see benefit, but it's an evolution. You start with one bite. That's the way you bite or eat the proverbial elephant is starting one bite at a time, making one small improvement, getting momentum from that, making another small improvement. But it's something that you will continuously be improving and expanding over time.
I think this one will probably be more directed to Eve and John. Is, you've talked about Microsoft systems and you've talked about Trimble systems. Well, how do those two kind of talk to each other, or how are those synced together as systems?
Giovanni, why don't you go first on the Trimble side?
Right. So Microsoft's partnership with us is key, as well as Wolpert. But I can tell you that the Microsoft tech stack, we would not be here without the tech stack from Microsoft. We've been saying enterprise asset management this whole webinar, but I don't think we said CityWorks once. That's our key enterprise asset management system. And, some of the outputs of CityWorks is produced via Microsoft. You could think about some of the Excel files, etc. Without that partnership and without that tech stack, we wouldn't be as successful as we are today as an organization. Eve, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. So as John mentioned, the tech stack there's a bit of an echo, sorry. The products that Trimble is based on the CityWorks technology is built on Microsoft technology, and it is housed in Microsoft Azure Cloud. Similarly, when I talk about some of the examples around some of these future state outcomes, the same data sources within CityWorks can also be applied to other Azure capabilities, Azure data services, such as our data lake. With the advent of Azure OpenAI, which is not the topic of today's conversation, but we can help to apply other capabilities such as that to the same data that can improve even further on some of the predictability of some of these outcomes that we're seeking. So again, the partnership with Microsoft and Trimble is that Trimble's technology is built on Microsoft platform, and that enables that extensibility for other use cases that can be surrounded by Microsoft technology as well. Not only that, but also an example is around the security components, making sure that you reapply role-based access control. So only the people with the authority and the permissions to access the data have it. So again, your mission critical data is secured. So those are some of the examples of how Microsoft and Trimble are working together. It's not in conflict when we mention Microsoft technologies and Trimble technologies, but thank you very much for that question.
Awesome. Well, that is all the questions that we have, but we do have a few minutes. So if we want to go around the horn here, and if anyone has any final thoughts to give a little, just as we kind of close out the day, and we'll just go in order of the presenters. John, if you have any final thoughts before we sign off for the day.
Absolutely. First off, thank you, Eve. Thank you, Scott. Our partnership with Microsoft and Wolpert, I can't, explain my appreciation to you guys. you know, I see us as Trimble as a whole. We've been in the airport market for a while, but I see us growing immensely in the next few years because of our partnership with you two. And it's, I mean, Scott, you've seen it in the past 6 months. We went from, you know, a small pipeline to a huge pipeline, and we're helping our customers out jointly. And I'm just really looking forward to the future. The partnership is great, and yeah, thank you for calling in today, Scott, and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'll jump in next. I echo everything John's saying, but I also like to leave you with a quote from the person who has become my life coach, Ted Lasso. There's 2 buttons I never like to hit: the panic and the snooze. And so when we're talking about digital transformation, I think that's an important concept to keep in mind. You don't want to panic. The world's not completely passing you by. You're probably in the same boat as most of your competitors or colleagues. So you don't want to panic, but at the same time, you don't want to hit snooze either. You need to start now, in particular, getting your data house in order if you want to be able to leverage all these cool technologies you see, as far as, we mentioned digital twin, AI, IoT, AR, VR, all of these technologies require having good quality data and an infrastructure that supports data interoperability. So you need to start putting those building blocks in place and start focusing on those, non-sexy activities to put you in position to get the big bang for your buck down the road.
So I don't know exactly how I follow that. I'm sitting here like a bobblehead in complete and unanimous agreement. And maybe just in the words of Ted Lasso as well, I want to hit the little sign over the door and say, believe. This is not vaporware. This is not, an art of the future hypothetical scenario. This is something that the 3 companies are implementing in real world today for other airport customers. So again, don't panic, don't snooze, and believe this is real, and we are here to help.
Be a goldfish. Don't be afraid to make mistakes when you're doing things. So yeah, so that's all the time we have today. Thanks everyone for participating, for joining the webinar. Props again to Scott, Eve, and John for putting on a great presentation. Once again, these slides are going to be available in the next couple days, so if you want to share it out to other individuals, that's going to be a good opportunity to do that. If you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great day. We'll see you for our next webinar coming up in the next handful of weeks. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.